So today, let's start with a question. The history of animation is one that is full of interesting inventions and unique processes. Popular culture, though, tends to imagine animation as largely the effort of artists. But animation could not exist without the efforts of engineers and inventors. So here's today's question. Back during the first boom of 3D in the 1950s, the Disney studio created 3D animation. That is, animation that was designed to be viewed through polarized, or what was then called Polaroid glasses, to create a believable 3D effect. Live-action productions during this time used side-by-side cameras mounted on a unique rig system, one camera taking in the image related to the left eye, the other taking in the image related to the right, to create full 3D scenes. But the Disney 3D efforts in animation used only one camera. Not only that, all of the images, the painted cells of foreground and midground action along with the background image, were stacked one on top of the other with no space in between to create some natural depth between the layers. It was just a standard table camera setup, with all of the art pressed flat beneath a piece of glass. Let's add in one more thing. These cartoons were in color, as color was part of the signature presentation of Disney animation, but Disney only used black and white film. Some of you likely know how this last bit was accomplished, but here's the overall question. How did Disney create color 3D cartoons using only flat images stacked close together, with one camera, and with reels of black and white film? And for those of you who think you might have part of the answer relating to color, let me add in one more complication for you technically minded listeners. There was no prism in this camera to separate the image as there was during Disney's early efforts with color in the 1930s. Okay, I realize that's a lot, but hopefully you have most of that in your head now. If so, let's spin back the hands of time and fall into the story of how 3D comes into being in Hollywood and how Disney adapts these efforts to make some unique and seldom seen cartoons. So if you're ready, here we go. The history of stereo images, or 3D images, goes back to the early days of photography. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, many homes had a stereo optic viewer or a stereoscope to enjoy 3D images of notable places and people from around the world. A typical stereoscope would have two openings to look through, sort of like the back half of a pair of binoculars. And then the front half of the stereoscope would have a place to set a photographic card. The card had two images, one for the left eye, one for the right. These images were usually taken at the same time with side-by-side cameras, though there were some early stereo cameras that were capable of taking twin images inside of the same camera unit. When you looked through a stereoscope at a stereo image card, your left eye would focus on the left image, your right would focus on the right, and your brain, noticing the small differences between the two images, created a 3D image that offered realistic depth. If you've ever been to the Carousel of Progress at Disney World, there's an early scene in the attraction where the narrator's son, Jimmy, is using a stereoscope to look at a 3D photo of, as he puts it, Little Egypt doing the hoochie coochie at the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Jimmy holds this relatively light device up to his eyes, and from the twin images he can see Little Egypt, the belly dancer, in realistic 3D. Around this same time, this technique was adapted for magic lantern slideshows used in vaudeville or by traveling show people. Here's how it worked, again long before the show itself. Twin images, one for the left eye, one for the right, were taken with side-by-side cameras or with a stereo camera capable of taking twin images. For the presentation, the show place would need to have two side-by-side projectors, each fitted with a colored lens or gel. One of these projectors would typically present a red filtered image, the other a blue filtered image, though it was possible to use different colors. Viewers were given glasses, one side with a red-toned lens, the other with a blue-toned lens, to cross-cancel the double image on screen. The red lens would filter out the red projected image, the blue lens would do the same for the blue-toned one, allowing each eye to see one distinct image, even though both images were projected onto the same screen. Again, the viewer's brain would take these two images and assemble them into a black and white presentation with depth. Variations on this included a process to dye one image blue and to dye the other red, thereby eliminating the need for color filters placed in front of the projector at a theater. And from here, as moving pictures became a larger part of vaudeville and of Nickelodeon's, it was a relatively easy jump from creating a 3D slideshow to creating a moving picture show in 3D. Though there were likely many early experiments with 3D, the earliest 3D film for a public presentation was likely made by the Lumiere brothers in 1903, which showed once again the arrival of a train, simply a train moving into a station and then coming to a stop. But a moving image in 3D in 1903 was a technical wonder, something almost from the future. There was no story in this short film, just the thrill of watching a moving image on screen that held tremendous depth. Early 3D film presentations in the late 19-teens and early 1920s were often short travelogues or documentaries that allowed viewers to feel as though they were actually looking at Niagara Falls, the Canadian Rockies, the Grand Canyon, Washington, D.C., or conversely, watching rituals of Native Americans in Arizona. The twin images for these early moving pictures could also be arranged onto a single strip of film. Through a dye process, the image for one eye was dyed blue, the other dyed red. With this, a single standard 35mm projector could present the film, and audience members wearing red and blue lensed glasses would then have the sensation of seeing a black and white image with surprising depth. Though there were some early experiments in using 3D films to tell stories, particularly some one-reel comedies in which part of the humor was in actors throwing or directing objects at the audience, by the late 1930s and early 1940s, most 3D offerings were arranged as demonstrations of the 3D experience itself and were often presented at state fairs or various public exhibitions. For most major studios, the use of 3D was too costly and inefficient to effectively manage. 3D added to production budgets, but 3D was also limiting. Big-budget films in the 1940s were typically filmed in Technicolor. But because current 3D technology used colored lenses to essentially block out one color spectrum from each eye, thereby creating the illusion of depth, Hollywood studios were unable to present a color image in 3D. Essentially, studios found it far more valuable to use full color rather than 3D for their big-budget films. Though while Hollywood was ignoring 3D, various inventors and amateur engineers were experimenting with a different process to create a better viewing experience. One of these experiments was with polarized light. In Italy in 1936, a 3D film presentation was created using two linked projectors and polarized light. The linked projectors each sent simultaneous overlapping images onto the same screen, with one projector presenting the image for the left eye, the other for the right. Each projector had polarizing filters set at a unique angle, typically at 45 degrees for one and 135 degrees for the other. Audience members wore polarized glasses, with one lens set to block out light arranged through that 45-degree filter, and the other to block out light that was sent through the filter set at 135 degrees. This process required audience members to keep their heads relatively still. If a person tilted their head by 10 or 20 degrees, it changed the orientation of the glasses and allowed viewers to see a double image on screen. But this process did have one tremendous benefit. As the polarizing process, or what was then called the Polaroid process, didn't use colored lenses to cross-cancel a stereo image. It instead used polarized light. Filmmakers now had a system that could present 3D moving images in full color. This process almost surely would have moved into Hollywood quicker, except for one thing: the war. By the late 1930s, Italy was moving toward World War II, where it would join Germany and essentially find itself cut off from the West. If 3D survived in any popular form during the war and the post-war years, it was not through moving pictures, rather through amateur 3D realist slides, which could be viewed through a personal viewer, not significantly different than those used 50 years earlier. Hold up a viewer to your eyes and see a 3D image, though this image was made with twin slides rather than twin photographs. Stereo realist slides could also be projected. Only after the war did the polarized 3D process find a larger audience. The first significant popularization of the polarized process occurred in 1951 as part of the Festival of Britain. There, a small group of full-color 3D shorts were presented in a newly built theater. The Festival of Britain, which focused on recent achievements of the UK, attracted millions of visitors, many of whom saw color 3D moving images with the Polaroid process for the first time. While this was happening and bringing some attention back to 3D cinematography in Europe, in California, two brothers set about to form a small production company and make a picture about the enthusiastic lives of young hot rod racers. The brothers were Milton Gunsberg, an out-of-work scriptwriter, and Julian Gunsberg, a successful ophthalmologist, both of whom had created stereo realist slides for years. While shooting either background or perhaps reference footage of local hot rod races, they wondered why their 16mm footage didn't have the visual vitality of their amateur 3D stereo slides. From there, the brothers found a cinematographer and engineer named Friend Baker, who had developed an experimental 16mm 3D camera rig that could be used on location, a project that he had worked on for years. Milton Gunsberg hired Baker to take test footage of a local hot rod race. The brothers liked what they saw. It better captured the energy of the event than standard 2D film. But everyone on the project understood that 16mm lacked the visual clarity for a full theatrical release, so Baker developed what might be considered the first modern 3D professional movie camera. As with standard 16mm cameras, 35mm cameras were also too large to be placed side by side to create an effective 3D image, as the gap between the cameras was far wider than the gap between a person's two eyes. For a camera rig to effectively capture 3D, the distance between the 2 points of vision, typically the two camera lenses, needs to be roughly the distance between two human eyes. Only with this arrangement could the two cameras create images that the human mind would then process as having depth similar to the depth human eyes observed in the real world. To solve this problem, the Gunsberg-Baker team mounted two full-size 35mm cameras onto a rig with their lenses directly facing each other. They then created a 90-degree angled mirror system so that the images the cameras received came from a second set of twin lenses arranged perpendicular to the cameras and positioned halfway between the two camera bodies. This new set of lenses had a gap between their centers of roughly 2.5 inches, which is roughly the space between a person's two pupils. Essentially, this very wide and somewhat heavy rig had at its center two glass circles that resembled a pair of eyeglasses. These two eyeglass openings were the access point for the images that would then enter the unit after hitting mirrors, one of which sent the left image to the left camera and the other the right image to the right. With these mirrors in place, this became a working 3D camera rig capable of producing stereo images on synced 35mm reels of film. The twin cameras would also use AnsoColor monopack film, which was less expensive and far less cumbersome than Technicolor. For the most part, a Technicolor production used a very large camera that simultaneously captured a moving image on 3 near-identical strips of film, isolating the color spectrum through cyan, magenta, and yellow filters. Once filming was complete, Technicolor engineers could use these 3 strips or 3 color records to adjust color levels in the final print to produce a deeply saturated, inviting image. AnsoColor used a single strip of film in which the final color levels could not be adjusted or modified in the same way as Technicolor. But a single strip or monopack film system was nearly essential for a rig that already held 2 large 35mm cameras, as it would be very difficult to mount 2 Technicolor cameras due to their size and weight onto a rig that was designed to work on location. This unit, Friend Baker and the Gunsberg brothers would call Natural Vision. Though the Gunsberg brothers never made their film about hot rodding, they did interest an independent filmmaker, Arch Obler, to create a 3D feature using their Natural Vision equipment, sort of a proof of concept that the Gunsberg brothers might be able to use to open later doors. Obler saw this new type of 3D as a way to lure his audience away from their TVs and back into movie theaters. A Natural Vision 3D film could create an experience far different than what people could experience at home in front of the family TV set. In April 1952, Arch Obler announced his project, an independent film called The Lions of Gulu, a turn-of-the-century story about workers creating the first transcontinental railway in Africa, who are then plagued by a series of lion attacks. "It'll make television look flat," Obler said. "The industry has got to go for this. It's dynamite against television." The film would star mid-list actors Robert Stack and Barbara Britton. The female lead, according to Obler, was particularly difficult to cast, as many actresses were concerned that a 3D presentation might change how the public saw them. Specifically, they were concerned that they would be seen as extremely skinny, which was more flattering in 2D than it was in 3D. By June, the title of the film was changed to the more alluring Bwana Devil. Also by June, the film was in production. The film was largely shot in the brown brush foothills just north of Los Angeles, around Agoura Hills, which reminded Obler of a trip he had once made to Africa. With this, the first modern 3D production moved forward, though this production was also far from perfect. The lions were trained and never looked particularly threatening on screen. The dialogue was at times stilted, and the story, with its man against beast theme, aligned far more with B-movie material than with anything that came from top studios. In the end, though, the 3D effects were stellar, with camera crews working to frame most shots with foreground, midground, and background elements, so that most scenes had a strong sense of depth when viewed through Polaroid glasses. Only a few weeks after production finished, this experimental film opened at 2 Paramount theaters in Los Angeles, the Hollywood Paramount and the Downtown Paramount. It's likely the production team at this point could neither afford much beyond the 2 sets of prints, nor could they likely find many more theaters willing to screen a movie with an experimental 3D process, one that would require glasses for audience members and extra staff in the projection booth. Bwana Devil opened on Wednesday, November 26, 1952, the day before Thanksgiving. Despite the film's shortcomings, Bwana Devil was an immediate sensation, drawing long lines largely filled with spectators interested in seeing the wonders of this new 3D process. 1 week later, the LA Times ran an article charting the surprising success of this film. All existing attendance records at both the Paramount Hollywood and Downtown theaters have been broken by the first feature film in natural vision 3-dimension, Bwana Devil. The engagements are reportedly eliciting more than just local interest. Managers of both theaters report patrons from as far away as San Francisco, Tucson, Arizona, and Mexico. One early reviewer, Lowell Redeling, after criticizing the story for its simplicity, recognized the film's great strength. The novelty of a dancing foot, a tossed spear, a pointing finger coming right at you out of the screen is hard to laugh off, he said. It's different and sometimes thrilling. In short, Bwana Devil wasn't about storytelling as much as it was about a technological spectacle. With this, large Hollywood studios were suddenly interested in creating their own 3D productions in an attempt to lure people away from their living room TV sets. Some studios also believed that they could create superior 3D films, particularly in terms of storytelling and acting. At the top of this list would be The House of Wax, starring Vincent Price and produced at Warner Brothers. The film would present the story of a wax sculptor deeply disfigured in a fire who now, unable to sculpt with his hands, uses human corpses encased in a thin layer of wax to create new figures for his strange and disturbing museum. Unlike Bwana Devil, House of Wax would largely be shot on sound stages, where light could be carefully controlled to more deeply emphasize, through spots and shadows, the depth of each scene. Like Bwana Devil, the production crew carefully assembled each shot with foreground, multiple midground elements, and a background to further deepen the 3D effect. This became a new way for directors and cinematographers to think about shots when composing them. "We've done everything possible to scare the audience," Vincent Price said while House of Wax was in production, "and we've got a fire scene in which a blazing wall falls toward the audience. If that doesn't scare them, nothing will." Though other animation studios would eventually develop 3D cartoons in 1953 or 1954, shorts featuring Woody Woodpecker, Casper the Friendly Ghost, and Bugs Bunny, Walt Disney was among the first animation producers to recognize and react to this shift in the movie-going habits of Americans. He understood that large live-action studios were about to experiment and invest heavily in 3D, and that his cartoons might find more bookings if some of them were also in 3D, allowing theaters then to create an all-3D program from cartoon to feature. But to maximize bookings, of course, these 3D cartoons would also need to be created in an alternate 2D format so they could be paired with any film at any theater. In looking over those shorts currently in production, Walt focused then on an experimental cartoon being developed largely by longtime animator and new director Ward Kimball. The film was called Melody, and unlike the Mickeys or the Donalds, it didn't rely on traditional Disney animation with its rounded forms and fluid movements, nor did it tell a traditional story. The cartoon was, in ways, a visual essay, a film in which an animated owl lectured on the importance of music in defining the emotional landscape of human experience. For Melody, Ward Kimball consciously broke with Disney traditions. He brought in a couple of designers to shape the film far outside of the studio's traditional house style. The first of these designers was Tommy Orub, a layout man who wanted to create characters with a flat graphic style similar to that of New York advertising. The second was a brilliant fine arts painter named Ivan Earl. Recently hired by the studio to paint backgrounds, Earl was already causing problems because his backgrounds, though appearing flat, were so rich in detail that they occasionally detracted from foreground action. The cartoon was originally arranged as an educational film, meaning it was initially designed to be shown in schools, not in theaters, as part of an Adventures in Music series that would teach school children about the elements of a song, from instrumentation to lyrics to melody. The unique visual design for Melody was a pastiche of styles: full character animation, limited animation, modern art inserts, characters arranged as pin outlines, and abstract backgrounds that appeared to be inspired by the gorgeous ballet sequence at the end of An American in Paris. According to Kimball, to create a new look for the film, members of his animating team were cutting out old valentines and were gluing them to the background. This inventive style, in addition to creating a unique visual tone for a new Disney cartoon, had one other strong point right now. The various flat layers, from the cutouts to Ivan Earl's backgrounds to animation that resembled the style of New York advertising firms, would be far easier to separate into dimensional planes than a traditional Disney cartoon. After viewing the film and understanding its strengths, Walt Disney took Ward Kimball aside and said that he would like to release this film theatrically, not just on the educational market. Then he added, they've got this new 3D thing. Do you think we can take that Melody picture and convert it to 3D? With this, a small camera team, primarily Eustace Lycett and Albiworks, calculated how to reshoot the film, with one camera position taking in images for the left eye and another for the right. The decision to explore 3D was a good one, in that this film received significant attention from the trade journals, who discussed how 3D animated shorts might strongly pair with highly popular 3D films. The review Variety gave of the film was good, though not glowing, in that the trade said it contained charm and originality, and that it was a tuneful and engaging short. In ways, Melody was lightly adapted into 3D. The depth in the 3D presentation was visible, but as 3D was essentially an afterthought, the feeling of depth wasn't as large as it was in some live-action features. The next Disney effort would be planned for 3D from the start, a Donald Duck cartoon called Working for Peanuts. It would be overseen by director Jack Hanna. As it was initially conceived as a 3D effort, Hanna's crew wanted to incorporate depth effects as richly as possible, often to support visual comedy. The main thing I remember about working in 3D, Hanna said, was to be sure that there were plenty of effects. The effects had to be designed so they would come out at you. Anything we could do to take advantage of the third dimension, we used. I was green at it and didn't know much about it, so we loaded it with animated effects like water coming right at you. In all likelihood, the easiest way to film a 3D hand-drawn cartoon such as this would be to visually separate the layers and arrange them on a multiplane unit so that there could be physical distance between foreground, various midground layers, and the background, creating natural depth through physical separation. But the cost to do this would have been prohibitive. First, the Disney machine and camera team would need to devise a Technicolor camera rig similar to what Fred Baker had developed for Natural Vision, with the two camera lenses mounted in such a way they faced a 90-degree mirror so that the twin images collected on film were spaced roughly as far apart as a pair of human eyes. Next, the team of roughly a half-dozen camera technicians would need to operate the massive multiplane unit, changing multiple cells on multiple glass shelves for each shot and making sure that various lights arranged for each shelf lit the layers correctly. For a 6-minute cartoon, this process would likely cost more than such a film could ever earn, even one in 3D. Instead, the Disney team needed to find an inexpensive way to use a single downward-facing table camera to create a 3D film, also a film in Technicolor. In this complex question, the color aspect is likely the easiest to answer. Color Disney animation from the 1930s used a standard Technicolor Process 4 camera. Behind the lens of this Process 4 camera was a prism that divided the image into 3 paths. One light path led to a cyan filter, another to a magenta, and a third to a yellow. Each of these color records was captured on a separate strip of black and white film, but with the color filters, the three images together held all the visual information necessary to produce a highly precise color image in the finished project. But by 1953, Disney had simplified the process so that its animation camera no longer needed a prism, nor did it need three separate strips of black and white film. These elements were still necessary for live action, as the three color records needed to be captured simultaneously, but as the process of filming Disney animation required a camera to capture a still image of painted cells and a background, the Disney camera could use just one reel of film. When a cell setup was ready to be shot, the Disney table camera, fixed with a rotating filter wheel, would capture three images in succession. One in cyan, then the wheel would rotate one click, then magenta, then another rotating click, and finally yellow. The three color records were arranged in a row on a single strip of film, which then, after being developed, could be separated out to make a full-color record to guide the Technicolor dye process. The invention of the rotating filter wheel in itself significantly reduced the work of a camera operator. But next was the more difficult question. How then could a single, downward-facing table camera create two visual records that then might create the two reels necessary for a 3D presentation? For this, Walt asked his longtime mechanical wizard, Eustace Lycett, to arrange a solution. Lycett was an unusual person to find in an animation studio. Though born in England, he had studied mechanical engineering at Caltech. As a student, he once believed that he would find work in a traditional engineering field, but as he graduated during the Depression, he was happy for whatever work came his way. Though he had no training in art, he found a job at the Disney studio just as Walt was struggling toward his first feature, Snow White. Lycett worked on a team that created special cameras for this effort, including the first multiplane unit. From there, he focused his work not only on cameras, but on ways to create visual effects for animated films and later for live-action projects. Lycett understood the basic assignment. Likely to manage costs, this unique 3D cartoon would need to be created with a traditional table camera designed to film basic animation. His solution was this. Each scene in Working for Peanuts would be shot once as though it were a standard 2D effort. These scenes could be used to create both the image for the left eye and to create a standard 2D cartoon, as surely Working for Peanuts would find its way into many theaters not showing a 3D feature. But then each scene would be reshot a second time using the exact same cells and backgrounds, only each of these cells would be shifted a little to the side. And before we talk about exactly how this works, first do this. Hold your index finger in front of your nose. Close one eye, then the other, back and forth, and notice how your finger seems to jump a few inches to the right and then to the left. Next, hold your index finger still raised at arm's length from your face. Again, close one eye and then the other, back and forth. And now notice how this same finger only seems to jump an inch or maybe even a little less back and forth. When looking at objects through just one eye and then the other, objects closer to your eyes appear to have a larger distance between their placement in your field of view than do objects further from your eyes. Understanding all this, Lycett knew that he needed to create a reliable equation that told camera operators how far to shift each cell layer, essentially using math to create stereo effects that would mimic the view field differential between a person's two eyes. A scene setup for Working for Peanuts might have 4 layers of art, with each layer presenting characters or items presumably a little further away from the camera than the last. He worked out his calculations to 1/100th of an inch for each scene. For example, for one scene setup, one layer might need to be shifted 0.37 of an inch to the right, the next 0.14 of an inch, the next 0.06 of an inch, and the last would remain in place as in the standard 2D arrangement. This configuration would create the image for the right eye. Lycett figured out these calculations for every cell layer for every scene in the entire cartoon. These small shifts, when projected in conjunction with the left eye version, would create the illusion of not only foreground and background, but also multiple layers of midground, giving the finished cartoon a nuanced expression of continuous depth. With this, Disney now had a reliably cost-effective way to produce 3D animation in Technicolor using a standard table camera setup. As with all 3D projects, there were extra costs. Each cartoon would need to be shot twice, with some carefully managed cell shifts required for the version intended for the right eye. Disney also needed to print both a left and right eye version of the film for each theater presenting the cartoon in 3D. But likely these costs were manageable, particularly if there was an increased rental charge for 3D work. Shortly after Disney entered the 3D market, a reporter talked with Walt about the future of 3D animation at the Disney studio. Walt seemed less than optimistic. "Well, how many more we make depends on how long the theaters run them," he explained. "If the novelty holds up, we have some more 3D cartoons in the works now, but we don't know whether the novelty will last long enough for every one of those to get into theaters." But even then, during what might have been called the golden year of 3D, Walt could see the coming problems. He knew that the trend had been created by a sense of novelty with in-your-face visual effects, not so much on the merits of narrative or character development. People won't go unless there's a good story, Walt predicted. He also saw the problems with the viewing format, and there's a nuisance to wearing Polaroid glasses, he added. As usual, Disney could sense trends coming and going. His studio was among the first to produce 3D animation, and his would be among the first to leave. Not long after Working for Peanuts was released, Hollywood began to pivot away from 3D. In part, the fad was over. The unique wonders of Bwana Devil now felt more commonplace. But perhaps more importantly, the cost of producing 3D work in live action, with the additional crew, additional film expense, additional film reels required for 3D, likely contributed to its relatively quick demise. Beyond this, studios soon found that there were limitations to 3D as well. One director at Fox observed, "You can't have a close-up, or 2/3 of the screen will be empty." Others believed that it would be near impossible to have fast cuts, as that would ask the audience to refocus their gaze and their understanding of depth too quickly. The general belief was that immersion into a new 3D scene required a little more time for an audience to acclimate themselves to each new camera setup. For theaters, there was also the cost of having two projectionists to manage the twin-synced projectors for each showing instead of just one, as well as the cost of disposable glasses for customers, which were sometimes included in the elevated cost of 3D film rentals and sometimes not. Regardless of the fate of 3D, Hollywood still needed some way to combat the public's growing fascination with TV. That is, to find a way that the visual experience of the theater was drastically superior to that of watching TV. But after roughly a year and a half of 3D, studios started to look to widescreen as a more cost-effective and equally prestigious way of creating visual spectacle at cinemas. Most widescreen options could be managed without glasses, without two projectionists, and without the additional reels of film to create a 3D effect. And with that, the first large boom of 3D in Hollywood started to come to an end. But as an epilogue to the story, 2 years after Working for Peanuts appeared in theaters, Walt approved a plan to bring his 3D cartoons to Disneyland. For years, 3D films had survived in various expositions and World's Fairs as a type of unique entertainment that people simply couldn't see back home. With the 3D boom over, 3D could again become a rarity, something that people typically saw at a special event or a unique venue. Walt proposed that the studio create new color 3D footage of the Mouseketeers, who were tremendously popular in the mid-1950s. Not only would 3D be a novelty, but it would be the first time most viewers saw the Mouseketeers in color, as their show, like all shows of the day, was aired in black and white. Presented in the Mickey Mouse Club Theater in Fantasyland, the program would be called the 3D Jamboree, which presented Melody, Working for Peanuts, and the new material with the Mouseketeers. The show proved to be far more popular than Disney expected, with thousands attending most days. The film presentation opened on June 16, 1956, in the 400-seat theater. The presentation required a B ticket. In his personal notes from the summer of 1956, Disney producer Harry Title talked about the growing popularity of this new attraction. Yesterday, they hit the all-time record with 3,464 in one day. On July 10th, we broke the record with 3,735 people. July 16th, they think it's possible to get something like 48,000 pairs of glasses, which will tide them over for a few weeks. The 3D presentations lasted at Disneyland through the 1950s, though in the early 1960s, Disney 3D efforts faded away from the park, with the theater, now called the Fantasy Theater, showing other pieces of Disney animation, such as the 29-minute featurette from 1947, Mickey and the Beanstalk. From there, 45 years later, the 3D version of Working for Peanuts was briefly shown in theaters along with a new Disney 3D film, Meet the Robinsons. But a public screening of Melody in 3D, along with the 3D Mickey Mouse Club footage, hasn't been presented in ages. And lastly, beyond those first Disney cartoons with mathematical depth, 3D has stayed in the parks in different ways. In terms of movies, Disneyland and Disney World have both presented a 3D film called Magic Journeys that showcased the effectiveness of 3D effects in the early 1980s. This was followed by Captain EO in the late 1980s. From there, filmed 3D effects found their ways into various attractions, including Star Tours, Mickey's PhilharMagic, It's Tough to Be a Bug, Remy's Ratatouille Adventure, Toy Story Mania, Flight of Passage, and others. Though 3D in the past couple of decades has had a theatrical resurgence, its longest presentation at Disney might be with the parks, a presentation that began many decades ago in 1956, when Walt observed that he had no place to show two relatively expensive and very unique cartoons, Melody and Working for Peanuts, now that the first big wave of Hollywood 3D was over. Just as in the 1930s and 1940s when 3D left theaters, it migrated to unique exhibition areas such as the World's Fair and, of course, Disneyland, which was where those films and those techniques continued to live and expand. I'll be back next week with a new story, but one final note before I go. If you happen to have a 3D TV and a 3D Blu-ray player, along with 3D glasses, there is one way to screen Working for Peanuts at home in 3D. Or maybe you might have a friend with this equipment. Working for Peanuts was included on a Blu-ray demonstration disc given to retailers to highlight Disney efforts with 3D about 15 years ago. You can usually find a few copies of this disc for sale on eBay. It's called Disney's Digital 3D Showcase. Along with Working for Peanuts, the disc includes clips of more recent Disney 3D efforts such as A Christmas Carol and Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland, which of course are available fully on 3D elsewhere. You can usually find copies of this disc used on eBay from between $20 to $30. But the rare item on the disc is just that one 1953 Donald Duck cartoon presented in 3D. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave this link down in the show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.